when people have a baby, a lot of times when you have a baby, it's a surprise. You know, of course, you can be very intentional about making a baby, but when a baby is made, it's made. And when it comes, it comes. That, right? At the end of the day, you don't have as much control over when and where you produce a child as you do over when and where you join in holy matrimony, right? There's a lot more intentionality that goes into that. You got to pick a date. You got to sign paperwork. You know, it's like you got to be present for that. And therefore, you have a lot more deciding power over whether or not you end up married. And I think you pointed to something that is critical that people need to consider, is that marriage is an expression of culture. Marriage is an expression of any number of things, but it's not necessarily an expression of biology. Biology is kind of hardwired, right? We are hardwired to propagate the species. Any species is hardwired to propagate the species, right? That's how species continue to exist, right? So whether or not marriage was a thing, there would be babies, okay? So we're not getting away from that. So if the culture shifts away from marriage is the all-important, be-all, end-all goal for relationships because of factors like you mentioned, Q, divorce rates, what comes along with divorce rates. I know women that don't want to get married because they don't want to go through the embarrassment of living through a failed relationship on public, display for the world to see. I know men that don't want to get married because they feel they have to protect what little fiscal, financial empire they've built up for themselves. And it just doesn't make sense for them, right? Once upon a time, marriage was that institution where it could help you grow your effective net worth. And now a lot of people don't see it that way, especially when you're hitching your wagon to somebody who can simply just decide one day that they just don't feel like being married anymore and leave and take half of everything that you've built. It's a poor fiscal move for anyone who's managed to kind of get their legs under them as an adult. And now that people do get married later in life, they tend to have more accumulated, and that's a lot bigger gamble. And then another point that you mentioned, Q, and I think that this speaks to this as well, is, when two people aren't married, it doesn't necessarily mean that the father is neglecting the children, right? As a person who's not married and don't want to be married ever, it doesn't make any sense for me. I can pay people to do everything that, when I ask people what's the benefit of having a wife, outside of hanging out with your soulmate or whatever, which you can do without marriage. But outside of that, everything else you can kind of just pay somebody to do, and indeed I do. I live by all the restaurants. There's somebody that comes and cleans my house for me, that sort of thing, and outside of the, spending time with someone that you care about, which again, you don't need marriage for that. It's just a poor financial move, right? But one of the things that I've learned and that I've seen in my lifetime is that, there's a lot of people who are not married and they are together. They decide to make a child, and the child is a forever commitment, or at least a, 21-year commitment. And the relationship doesn't necessarily need to be a lifetime commitment. It can be until such a time as it no longer serves us, right? But once that time happens, when it does in these examples, the fathers are still very present. And what ends up happening is that you split responsibility for the child, right? So what happens is your child spends 50% of the time with the mother, 50% of the time with the father. And what I've seen in situations like that is a child getting a heavy dose of what it means to be in the presence of their father, of a man, and a heavy dose of what it means to be in the presence of their mother. And what I've seen from yesteryear is the father and the mother are both in the home, sure, but the father can be absent while still being in the home, can be disconnected emotionally while in the home. The father doesn't prepare meals. The father doesn't get the kids ready for school. The father doesn't drop the kids. You know, there's a term soccer mom, right? That is a term from yesteryear. Mom is taking the kids to soccer practice and picking them up. Mom is doing all this stuff. Dad goes to work. Dad comes home. He eats with the family. And then that's it. The rest of the evening is his, right? Now imagine the 50-50 scenario where 100% of what happens during your time, it's you and your son, or you and your daughter, or you and your children. You're feeding them, you're driving them, you're picking them up, you're buying them clothes, you're doing all that. And that feels a lot more intentional. Okay. Now, the last thing I want to say is that this is the same Center for Disease Control that did this study, that did a report in, I think it was 2013 when it came out, that mentioned that Black dads were doing better than any other dads in terms of racial groups, in terms of parenting. Black dads were more intentional, more present, help with homework, change diapers, all that sort of stuff, drove children to and from school, on and on and on. And that level of intentionality matters, right? And this is why I said that these zombie myths won't die. It's what keeps, honestly, mostly white people and government, and some Black people too, from looking at the systemic issues. And they try to paint the failings of the Black community as simply moral failings of a group of people who've lost their way, as opposed to taking responsibility for the fact that there's been systemic disenfranchisement of this group of people for decades, right? Now, I want to add one last thing here. You mentioned that interracial births, I think it was 60%, something like that, of interracial births where the father was Black, the mother was white. 60% of them are to couples that aren't married. Well, the same study says that out-of-wedlock births are no longer confined to one racial group, as nearly 40% of all U.S. births occur outside of marriage. That means every single birth, only 60% of them are to a married couple. 40% is not to a married couple, right? So when you look at this tiny group of people, Black men, white women, their birth rate, and you see that that's 60%, you see, yes, you see that it's higher, but it's not an anomaly relative to the rest of the births in this country. That shows larger trends present in the larger culture, right? And yes, oftentimes everything, once it gets to Black people, it's skewed one way or another because of a number of one of the reasons I've delineated in this part of the conversation. But I want people to kind of take this with these grains of salt and know that this is not a moral failing of Black men. This is indicative of a number of factors. Now, it could be individuals. There could even be some data that does suggest something. I'm not going to say that that's not possible, but I think that there's a lot of ways that you could explain this that all make perfect sense. These aren't, women giving birth and the dads nowhere to be found, which is the image I think that this data suggests to people who aren't aware that these indeed are zombie myths that just simply won't die.